Walter Bricker had 11 days left to live, though nobody knew it yet, and 160 acres of Pennsylvania farmland that his children would inherit, except for the 4 acres behind the old stone wall, which had been padlocked since 1974. On the morning he died, a letter addressed to no one in particular was already sitting in the bottom drawer of his desk, waiting. The smell of cut hay always drifted through Walter's kitchen window first, before the coffee, before the light even finished climbing over the ridge behind the barn. He was 80 years old, and he still woke at 5, still pulled on the same brand of gray wool socks he'd worn since 1968, still stood at the counter for exactly 4 minutes while the percolator did its work, one hand resting flat on the cool enamel of the stove the way another man might rest a hand on a Bible. It was a small ritual, unremarkable to anyone watching, but Walter had built his whole life out of small rituals, because the big things, the things that actually mattered, had a way of being too heavy to hold every day. He had buried his wife, Edith, 9 years earlier, after 41 years of marriage, and he had buried something else long before that, something the town of Millhaven had learned not to ask about. Walter was not an unfriendly man. He waved at trucks on the county road. He brought sweet corn to the church picnic every August. He sat 2 pews from the back on Sundays. But there was a place inside him and a place on his land that he simply did not open for anyone. The field behind the stone wall, 4 acres of rolling grass at the eastern edge of the property, visible from the kitchen window but reachable only through a single gate, had worn the same rusted padlock for 20 years. No one had seen inside it. Not his children, not his neighbors. Not even Edith in her final years, though she had never once asked him to explain himself, which was its own kind of love. There was a second ritual, less visible than the first, that Walter kept even more faithfully. Every March, without fail, he drove his old Ford pickup to a nursery 2 counties over and came back with a single sapling wrapped in burlap, wedged upright in the truck bed like a passenger riding shotgun. He never told anyone what the tree was for. His neighbors assumed over the years that he was simply replacing windbreak trees lost to storms or indulging some private eccentricity that came with age and solitude. Only Walter knew that each sapling was bound for the same 4 fenced acres at the eastern edge of the farm, and that the errand, however small it looked from the road, was the most important thing he did all year. On the windowsill above his sink sat a small tin box, dented at one corner, the kind that had once held pipe tobacco. Walter touched it every morning before he touched anything else. It never left that windowsill. It would still be there when they found him. That morning the light came up pale gold over the ridge, and Walter carried his coffee out to the porch the way he always did, and he looked, as he always did, toward the locked gate at the edge of the eastern field. Whatever waited for him, there would have to wait one more day. But the ache in his chest that had been building for a week had a different plan. But what he didn't know was that this time there wouldn't be another day. That sentence never made it into English in Walter's own head because Walter didn't know it was coming at all. What he knew, standing on that porch with his coffee going cold in his hand, was only that the field was waiting, the way it had waited every morning for 20 years, patient as stone. By noon, Walter Bricker was gone, and the padlock on the eastern field was still locked. The call came to Carol first, because Carol was the one who still lived close enough to check on him. 22 minutes down Route 9 in Lansdale, a 40-minute drive she'd made every Sunday for the better part of a decade. It was the mail carrier who found him, slumped in the porch chair, coffee cup shattered on the boards beside him, his face turned toward the eastern field, as though he'd been looking at it when his heart finally quit. Carol got the call at 11:40 in the morning and was on Route 9 by 11:52, driving too fast, her hands shaking on the wheel, already dreading the phone call she'd have to make to her brother. Marcus picked up on the 4th ring. He was 3 states away in Columbus, where he sold commercial insurance and hadn't set foot on the family farm in 14 months. "It's Dad," Carol said, and that was all she needed to say. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that had followed every hard conversation the 2 of them had ever had about their father. A man who loved them, They both believed that, but who had never once in 80 years told either of them why the eastern field was locked. The farm had been in the Bricker family since 1902, passed down through 3 generations of men who broke their backs to keep 160 acres solvent. Walter had inherited it from his own father in 1959, at 23 years old, newly married to Edith, full of the kind of plans young men make when they think the ground beneath them is permanent. He had built the herd up to 60 head of dairy cattle by 1970. He had put a new roof on the barn in 1968. And in 1974, for reasons no one living could explain, he had fenced off 4 acres at the eastern edge of the property, put a padlock on the gate, and never once, in 50 years afterward, let another living soul inside. Carol arrived to find 2 county sheriff's cars already in the driveway, and a scene that would haunt her for months. Her father's body being carried out on a stretcher, the porch chair overturned, the ridge behind the house catching the noon sun in a way that felt almost cruel in its beauty. She sat on the porch steps for a long time after the ambulance left, staring at the padlocked gate at the far edge of the eastern field, 400 yards away, glinting faintly in the light. She had asked her father about that field exactly 3 times in her life. The first time, at age 9, he had told her it was not for children. The second time, at 17, he had simply walked away. The third time, at 34, standing at her mother's graveside, he had looked at her with an expression she had never forgotten, not anger, not secrecy, but something closer to grief so old it had calcified, and said only, "Someday, not today." Marcus arrived that evening, and the 2 of them sat at their father's kitchen table until well past midnight, going through papers neither of them understood. Deed records, an old insurance policy, a folder of receipts from a fencing company dated 1974. Nothing explained the field. The lawyer, a heavy-set man named Grady Ossie, who had handled Bricker family business for 20 years, came out the following afternoon to read the will, and it was there that the first real complication arrived. The farm's 160 acres were to be divided evenly between Carol and Marcus, except for the 4 acres behind the stone wall, which the will stated, in language so plain it felt almost cold, shall remain locked and untouched until such time as the attached letter is read aloud, in full, by both of my children together. There was no letter attached. Grady Ossie checked twice. Whatever letter Walter Bricker intended to leave behind, he had not gotten around to filing it with his attorney. Carol felt something cold settle into her stomach. Marcus felt something else. An old, familiar frustration, the same frustration he'd carried since he was a teenager, of loving a father who kept the most important room in his own heart bolted shut. 20 years, Carol, he said that night, pacing the kitchen. 20 years, and he couldn't just tell us. But what they didn't know was that the letter already existed. It just wasn't where it was supposed to be. Within a week, word had spread through Millhaven the way word always spreads in a town of 1,100 people. At the diner on Main Street, at the Lutheran Church coffee hour, at the feed store where Walter had bought grain every autumn for 6 decades, the eastern field became the only subject anyone wanted to discuss. Theories multiplied like weeds. Some of the old-timers, men who'd known Walter since boyhood, whispered about a buried still from Prohibition days, though none of them could say why a man would guard a whiskey still for half a century. Others, less kindly, suggested there might be something the Brickers would rather the county not find: an unmarked grave, an old accident covered up, a debt paid in silence. Ruth Calloway, who had lived on the neighboring farm for 40 years and considered herself Walter's closest living friend, shut down that particular rumor hard whenever she heard it, though even she admitted, sitting across from Carol at her kitchen table one gray afternoon, that Walter had never told her what was behind that fence either. "He told me once," Ruth said carefully, stirring her tea, "that it wasn't a secret he was keeping from you. It was a promise he was keeping to someone else." There was another visitor that week, less welcome than Ruth, a man named Daniel Rourke, a distant cousin on Edith's side, whom Carol had met only twice in her life, at funerals, which seemed to be the only occasions that brought the wider family together anymore. Daniel had heard about the locked field the way everyone in Millhaven had, and he arrived at the farmhouse with a friendly enough smile and an unmistakable agenda, hinting broadly that old family land like this sometimes hid mineral rights or buried valuables worth documenting properly, and offering, for a modest fee, to bring in a surveyor he happened to know. Carol thanked him for his concern and showed him to the door within 10 minutes, but the visit left her rattled in a way she hadn't expected. A reminder that her father's silence, whatever its true cause, had left a vacuum that other people were only too willing to fill with their own convenient stories. Carol turned that sentence over for days. A promise to someone else. But there was no one else. Edith was gone. Walter's parents were gone. His only sibling, a younger brother, had died in Korea in 1953. Who could Walter Bricker possibly still be keeping a promise to? The obstacles came from more than one direction. First, from Grady Osei's office, where the will's strange condition, the field locked until a missing letter surfaced, created a genuine legal tangle. A neighboring developer named Curtis Hale, who had tried twice before to buy Bricker land for a housing subdivision, saw an opening in the confusion and made an unsolicited offer within the month. $340,000 for the entire 160 acres, Eastern Field included, complications and all, as his letter put it, with a 30-day window to accept before the offer expired. Marcus, drowning in his own mortgage and 2 kids' worth of college tuition on the horizon, found himself doing the math late at night more than once. Then came the second obstacle, sharper than the first. Their father's dairy cooperative called to say Walter's herd, down to 11 aging cows by the time he died, needed to be sold or relocated within 60 days, cooperative bylaws being what they were, and the modest proceeds would barely cover the farm's back property taxes, let alone the cost of maintaining 160 acres that neither Carol nor Marcus, if they were honest with each other, had any real plan to keep. There was a third obstacle, quieter than the other two, but no less draining. Walter's estate, small as it was, still owed nearly $18,000 in back taxes and unpaid vet bills for the dairy herd, and the county tax office was not interested in waiting out a family's grief. A stern but not unkind clerk named Sarah Voss called Carol twice in 1 week to explain, in careful bureaucratic language, that failure to resolve the arrears within 90 days could result in a lien against the property, a lien that would complicate any future decision about the Eastern Field, locked or unlocked, memorial or not. Carol found herself doing arithmetic she'd never expected to do at her father's kitchen table, weighing what it would cost to keep 160 acres of land that neither she nor her brother had planned on inheriting so soon. And for the first time she understood, in her body, and not just her head, how easy it must have been for men like Curtis Hale to build a business out of grieving families who simply couldn't hold on any longer. It was Carol, going through her father's desk a second time 3 weeks after the funeral, who found the tin box was missing from the windowsill. She remembered it from childhood, the dented tobacco tin her father touched every single morning of her life, a habit so constant she'd stopped noticing it by the time she was 12. It wasn't in the kitchen. It wasn't in his bedroom. She found it, finally, tucked behind a false panel at the back of his closet, beside a single brass key that did not match any lock she recognized in the house. It was only then that she realized the key wasn't for the house. It was for the gate. She didn't open the tin box that night. She sat with it on her lap at her father's kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning, afraid, in a way she couldn't fully explain even to herself, of what might be inside. The gate had been padlocked with a heavy commercial lock, the kind meant to withstand bolt cutters, and for a moment, standing at the eastern fence line with Marcus on a cold Saturday morning 3.5 weeks after the funeral, Carol wondered whether they were even meant to use the brass key at all, or whether it belonged to something else entirely, the tin box perhaps, or a lockbox they hadn't yet found. But the key slid into the padlock's housing with a smoothness that suggested regular oiling, regular care, a ritual maintained even in secret, and the mechanism gave way with a small metallic sigh, as though the field itself had been waiting to exhale. What lay beyond the gate was not what either of them expected. No hidden foundation, no rusted equipment, no grave marker rising crooked from the grass. Instead, in 4 neat, deliberate rows running east to west, stood trees, 49 of them, evenly spaced, ranging from a towering black walnut, easily 50 years old, down to a sapling no more than knee-high, clearly planted within the last year. Carol counted them twice before she trusted the number. 49 trees and a 50th space, freshly turned, empty, waiting. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Marcus walked the rows slowly, running his hand along the bark of the oldest trees, and Carol stood at the gate with the tin box clutched against her chest, beginning for the first time since the funeral to understand that her father's silence had never been about hiding something ugly. It had been about protecting something unbearably tender. That night, back at the kitchen table, Carol finally opened the tin box. Inside, beneath a folded army photograph and a small pressed flower gone brittle with age, was the letter, the one their father's will had promised, the one Grady Ossie had searched for in vain. It was dated 11 days before Walter's death, written in his familiar slanted hand, and it began, "If you are reading this, then I have finally run out of mornings." But the letter didn't tell everything at once. Their father had let the story unfold gradually, just as he had lived it. The letter explained that the 10th tree in the second row, a modest sugar maple, nothing remarkable to look at, had been planted in April of 1975, 1 year after the field was first fenced off, in memory of a son named Peter Bricker, who had died at 19 years old in a tractor accident on the very ground where the field now stood. Peter had been Carol and Marcus's older half-brother, born to Walter and his first wife Diane, who had died in childbirth, and whose name neither of the younger siblings had ever heard spoken aloud in their father's house. The letter did not explain everything at once. It explained only enough, a name, a year, a single sentence, about a boy who loved this land more than I ever taught him to be careful of it, before folding back into silence, promising more, but not yet. Carol read the letter 3 times that night, and each time she reached the same unfinished sentence. The rest of it I couldn't put in ink, so I put it in the ground instead. She found herself looking out the dark kitchen window toward the eastern field, trying to understand what her father could possibly mean. It took Carol and Marcus most of a week to piece the fuller story together, and they did it the way Walter himself seemed to have wanted them to. Slowly, 1 layer at a time, the way a man peels back a bandage he's afraid to look beneath. Ruth Calloway, when Carol finally worked up the nerve to ask her directly about Peter, went quiet for a long moment before nodding, as if she'd been waiting 50 years for someone to ask. "I was 17 when it happened," Ruth said. "We all were. Whole town came out for the funeral. And then Walter just stopped talking about him. Like if he said the name out loud enough times, it might come apart in his mouth." Peter had died on an August afternoon in 1974, thrown from an overturned tractor on the eastern slope of the property, alone, with no one close enough to hear. Walter had found him himself an hour later when Peter didn't come in for supper. He was 22 years old at the time, newly a father to a 5-year-old boy from his second marriage, Diane having died years before Peter's accident, and Walter having remarried Edith not long after. And by every account Ruth could offer, the accident had broken something in him that never fully mended. Within a year he had fenced off the field where it happened. He never farmed that ground again. He never spoke his firstborn son's name in front of Carol or Marcus, not once in 40 years. The second discovery came from an old friend of Walter's, a retired county extension agent named Robert Aldous, who had helped Walter select saplings almost every spring for 2 decades without ever fully understanding why. "He'd call me every March," Robert told Carol over the phone, his voice thick with the particular sorrow of a man realizing too late the weight of something he'd treated as routine. "Ask me what grew well in Pennsylvania clay, sugar maple, black walnut, white oak, tulip poplar. I never asked him why he wanted a different tree every year. I figured it was just a hobby. Some men collect stamps. I thought Walter collected trees." It was Robert, going through his own records, who supplied the detail that finally made the shape of the memorial clear. 49 trees for 49 years since Peter's death, one planted faithfully every spring, without exception, rain or drought or Edith's own final illness, right up until the year before Walter's own death, when his hands had grown too unsteady to dig the hole himself, and he had hired a young man from town to do it for him instead. Standing over the boy's shoulder the whole time, directing the depth and the angle with the exacting care of a man performing a sacrament. The condition attached to this discovery arrived within days, and it was not simple. Curtis Hale's offer on the property was still on the table, its 30-day window closing fast, and the developer's renewed pressure now carried an edge of urgency. Word of the memorial field had reached the county's historical society, and a preservation officer named Thomas Whitfield had contacted Carol directly, warning her that any transfer of the property to a developer would very likely mean the eastern field's trees, none of them protected, none of them documented anywhere but in an old man's private ledger, would be cleared within a season for foundation work. If Carol and Marcus wanted the field to remain what their father had built it to be, they would have to refuse Curtis Hale's money and find another way to keep the farm solvent. And neither of them, 3 weeks past their father's funeral, had any idea how. Marcus was the one who nearly gave up. He drove back to Columbus for a long weekend, telling Carol he needed to think, but really running from a grief he didn't know how to hold. Grief not only for his father, but for a brother he'd never known existed. A brother whose death had shaped every closed door in their childhood home, without either of them ever understanding why. He sat in his own kitchen 3 states away and stared at a spreadsheet of the farm's finances until 2 in the morning, and the numbers told him, unambiguously, that keeping the property meant keeping the dairy operation running or finding some other income the land could generate, and he had neither the money nor, if he was honest, the desire to move his family back to Pennsylvania to try. It was a phone call from Carol, not an argument, but a single sentence, that brought him back. "Marcus," she said, "there's a 50th hole in the ground, already dug. Dad started it before he died. He just never got to plant the tree." Learning what their father had actually built took longer than either of them expected, and it was not simple work. Carol spent the better part of 2 months driving out from Lansdale every weekend, walking the rows with a notebook, matching each tree's estimated age against the extension agent's planting records, cross-referencing them with old family photographs to understand which years had been hardest. A gap in 1991, she noticed, the year Edith had a difficult surgery. A noticeably smaller, weaker sapling in 2009, the year of a drought so severe half the county's crops failed. The trees were not merely markers. They were a diary, written in bark and root, of every year Walter Bricker had survived his son's death, some years thriving, some barely holding on, but never once, in 49 years, skipped entirely. Her first real breakthrough came when she found, tucked inside an old ledger in the barn office, a hand-drawn map of the field with each tree labeled not by species, but by year, and beside several of them, a short private note in Walter's cramped handwriting. "The year Edith almost left me and didn't. The year the bank almost took the North 40. The year Carol was born, and I planted this one glad, for once." Reading that last note, sitting alone in the cold barn office with dust motes turning in a shaft of afternoon light, Carol wept for the first time since the funeral, not for her father's death, but for the version of him she had never been allowed to meet, a man capable of a tenderness so total he'd built a private forest out of his own grief and never once asked anyone to admire it. Marcus's breakthrough was harder won and came later after he'd flown back to Pennsylvania a second time, determined to sell his half of the inheritance and be done with the whole complicated mess. He walked the eastern field alone one evening, without Carol, planning to make peace with his decision, and instead found himself standing at the sugar maple, tree number 10, Peter's tree, the first one Walter had ever planted, running his fingers over a small brass plate half buried at its base that neither of them had noticed before. It read simply, "Peter, he loved this ground." Marcus stood there until the light went fully out of the sky, and when he called Carol that night, his voice had changed. "I get it now," he said. "I don't think Dad locked us out of this field. I think he was protecting it from becoming just another thing we'd argue about splitting up. He was waiting until we were ready to actually see it." Before Thomas Whitfield's solution ever entered the picture, Carol and Marcus tried a different approach first, and it failed badly enough to teach them something important. Convinced they could simply keep the whole operation running as their father had, dairy herd and all, they spent nearly 3 weeks that spring trying to line up a herd manager willing to work the farm on contract while they figured out the rest from a distance. 2 candidates fell through in the first week alone, one deciding the aging barn infrastructure wasn't worth the risk, another backing out after learning the herd was down to 11 cows, hardly enough to justify a full-time wage. A third candidate, a young farmer named Ellis Doyle from 2 counties over, actually signed on, spent 4 exhausting days trying to bring the milking parlor's decades-old equipment back up to code, and then quietly walked away, telling Carol with genuine regret that the whole enterprise would cost more to save than it would ever earn back. It was a hard 2 weeks of false hope, and by the end of it, both Carol and Marcus understood that keeping the farm exactly as their father had left it simply wasn't possible. Something would have to change, and it was only after that failure that they were willing to hear a different kind of solution at all. Rejecting Curtis Hale's offer meant finding another path, and it was Thomas Whitfield, the preservation officer, who ultimately showed them one, a conservation easement jointly filed with the County Historical Society. That would permanently protect the eastern 4 acres as a memorial woodland, while still allowing Carol and Marcus to lease out the remaining 156 acres of farmland to a young couple from the county who'd been searching for tillable ground for 3 years and couldn't afford to buy outright. The arrangement wouldn't make either sibling wealthy, but it would keep the farm in the family stewardship, keep the eastern field intact, and generate just enough steady income to cover the taxes, and then some. It took another 6 weeks of paperwork, 2 difficult conversations with Curtis Hale, who did not take the rejection graciously, and one long night where Marcus and Carol sat up until 3 a.m. Finally, truly arguing, not about money, but about who their father had really been, and what they owed him now that he was gone. That argument, painful as it was, became its own kind of gift. Somewhere around 2 a.m., worn down past the point of defending old grievances, Marcus admitted something he'd never said aloud, that he'd resented their father for years. Quietly, for a distance he could never explain, a coldness that showed up at strange moments. Birthdays, graduations, the day Marcus's own son was born, and that learning about Peter had cracked that resentment open like a shell. "He wasn't cold," Marcus said, staring at his coffee. "He was just already carrying someone we didn't know about." Carol, who had spent her whole life feeling like the family's designated peacemaker, finally let herself say that she'd resented that role too, resented always being the one who drove out on Sundays while Marcus stayed away, resented a father who never once explained why she had to shoulder it. They did not resolve everything that night. But for the first time in either of their adult lives, they stopped performing the roles they'd inherited and simply grieved together as 2 people who had lost the same imperfect, complicated man. The spring after Walter's death, on a cool April morning, almost exactly 1 year to the day since he'd dug the 50th hole, Carol and Marcus drove out to the eastern field together, their own children in the back seats of 2 separate cars for the first time in years. And they planted the 50th tree, a young sugar maple, chosen deliberately to echo Peter's, purchased from the same nursery Robert Aldous had recommended to their father decades earlier. Marcus dug the hole himself, refusing help, sweating through his jacket in the cold morning air, and Carol held the sapling steady while he packed the earth around its roots, the way she imagined her father must have done alone 49 times before. They had decided by then what to do with the field, not to keep it locked at all as their father had for 50 years, but to open it, carefully, to the community that had wondered about it for 2 decades. Working with Thomas Whitfield's office, they installed a modest wooden gate to replace the old padlocked one, a small engraved sign at the entrance, reading simply, "The Bricker Memorial Grove, open from dawn to dusk," and a weathered bench near the 10th tree, Peter's tree, where anyone who needed a quiet place to sit with their own losses could do exactly that. Ruth Calloway was the first visitor, the following Sunday, sitting alone on the new bench for nearly an hour. She told Carol afterward that it was the first time in 50 years she'd been allowed to properly say goodbye to the boy she remembered as a gangly 17-year-old who used to race her down the county road on his bicycle, back before either of them understood how short a life could be. The tin box found a new home, too, not hidden in a closet, but displayed in a small glass case Carol built herself and set on a shelf just inside the new gate. The pressed flower and the old army photograph and Walter's unfinished letter, all preserved together, available for anyone who wanted to understand the story behind the trees. Underneath, Carol added a small card in her own handwriting. 49 years, one tree at a time, now open to everyone he loved, including the ones he never got to meet. By the following autumn, the field had become something Walter Bricker could never have predicted when he first locked that gate in his grief-stricken 22nd year. Not a private wound kept hidden from the world, but a quiet gathering place where a handful of Millhaven families now came to sit beneath trees planted in years that had once felt unbearable, and to remember that grief, tended patiently enough, for long enough, can eventually grow into something that gives shade to other people too. Carol still drove out most Sundays, the same 40-minute drive she'd made for a decade, except now she parked at the eastern gate instead of the farmhouse porch. And she sat for a while beneath the sugar maple before she did anything else. Marcus flew back 3 or 4 times a year, more than he ever had while his father was alive. And every visit, without fail, he walked the rows alone first, counting the trees the way his father once had, understanding now exactly what each one had cost. Carol thought often, in those first months after the field opened, about the version of her father she had spent most of her life believing in. A man defined by what he withheld, by the door he never opened, by the name he never spoke. She understood now that she had been wrong about him in the way people are often wrong about the quietest person in a room, mistaking silence for emptiness instead of recognizing it for what it actually was, a container built to hold something too large for ordinary words. Her father had not failed to grieve. He had grieved with more discipline and more devotion than anyone she had ever known, 49 springs in a row, alone, without an audience, without once asking to be understood. It was, she realized, its own kind of faith, the belief that love did not require a witness to be real. Marcus came to a similar understanding by a different road. He had spent years quietly measuring his father against an ordinary, uncomplicated warmth he'd seen in other men's fathers, and finding him wanting. Standing at Peter's tree that second spring, watching his own children chase each other between the rows his grandfather had planted, one grief-soaked year at a time, Marcus finally let go of the measuring. Some men showed love in conversation. His father had shown it in cultivation, in the patient, unglamorous work of choosing a species, digging a hole, tamping down the soil, and returning the following March to do it again for half a century, long after anyone would have blamed him for stopping. The town of Millhaven changed its relationship to the field too, slowly, the way small towns absorb any new truth, first through gossip, then through curiosity, and finally through something closer to reverence. By the second autumn, a handful of families whose own losses had never found a proper place to rest began asking Carol quietly whether they might plant a tree of their own along the field's unused southern border, in memory of people the town itself had once loved. Carol and Marcus said yes with only one condition, one their father would have approved of without needing it explained. No plaques louder than Peter's, no ceremony grander than a Sunday afternoon, no name given more weight than any other. Grief, the field seemed to insist, was not a competition. It was a season, returning every year, asking only to be tended. The stone wall was still there, weathered and gray, running the length of the property, the way it always had. But the padlock was gone. What stood in its place was a gate that anyone could open, holding a field that no longer needed to be locked to be protected. because the people who mattered most finally understood what it had been guarding all along, and had chosen, at last, to guard it together.